I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico, and I teach media studies at Greenville University.
I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
So you might remember, a few weeks ago, we talked to Derek Ford and read a pretty neat article about Christianity and sort of like the history of Christianity within the DPRK. That was an article by a really neat scholar named Dae Young Ryu, who told us he didn't want to be on this podcast because he doesn't want to be on any podcasts. And you know what? I respect that. This week, though...
Me too.
Yeah, same. This week, we're circling back around to that good DPRK content and kind of getting into the topic a little bit further. So we read another of Dae Young Ryu's articles called Kim Il-sung and Christianity in North Korea from the Journal of Church and State, which is it's a journal that speaks for itself. It's a title that you know exactly what this is about before you get into it. So it's a pretty cool history that starts off with some biography about Kim Il-sung's life and also kind of gets into the policies that the Korean Workers' Party and also just the government of the DPRK sort of put into place with regards to religious people. So that's what we'll be getting into on this episode. That's what's in store.
And it's fresh. The article is published this year.
Hot off the presses.
Also, we should mention some cool Pope news to kind of set the stage. There's like a lot of reasons to talk about this article, but one reason we thought it would be cool is that the president of the Republic of Korea, Moon Jae-in, he recently went to the Vatican, and he relayed a message to the Pope that Kim Jong-un would like to see him in the DPRK. And Pope Francis said that he would be down. He would be interested in going if he got a formal invitation from Kim. So the ball is in the DPRK's court, I guess, but in theory, the Pope might be able to come. I guess he's going to go to Japan pretty soon, so some people are speculating that that would be a good time to kind of make a pit stop in the DPRK and potentially also China, but that would be pretty wild.
Yeah, no kidding. That would be a historic event indeed. People might be tempted to read that kind of headline, like Kim Jong-un wants to meet the Pope, as something that's kind of fantastic and completely out of the ordinary for the DPRK. And I mean, they wouldn't be exactly wrong, but getting a bit more into Dae Young Ryu's scholarship on religion and the DPRK, it actually seems kind of par for the course, or at least it doesn't seem that outlandish if you kind of take the entirety of the relationship between the DPRK and Christianity proper into perspective.
Billy Graham has been there, so can't get more outlandish than that.
Right. I mean, and he is kind of like the Pope in some ways.
Yeah, the Pope of evangelicals, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So that's something. Ryu's article is particularly interesting because it makes the argument that the DPRK is unique amongst 20th century socialist countries because of their tolerance for Christianity, which is kind of a different way to read the situation than maybe you normally hear. Ryu makes this argument through some short biography of Kim Il-sung's earlier life and a close reading of some of the statements that Kim Il-sung also made on Christianity specifically. I think that, Dean, you'll recall the last time we talked about the DPRK. Basically, anytime I ever talk about the DPRK with anybody, I always bring up the great church game Bible Smugglers. If you didn't go to an evangelical church camp, you probably didn't play this game, which is good for you, actually.
But imagine if you didn't and you also did play this game.
It would be too much. You had a weird childhood then. So I think this is actually... Bible Smugglers is a bad game that Christians in the United States play, Christian evangelical kids play, but it is kind of a good indication of the way that at least Christians, in my experience, have thought about the DPRK and communism in general. So before we get into the historical important stuff, I'm going to tell you all how to play Bible Smugglers. I could just kind of tell you from my recollections, but we found an actual authoritative source for Bible Smugglers. That authoritative source is the peer-reviewed journal youthgroupgames.com.au, so it's legit, coming from some real...
The authoritative voice in youth group studies.
If you want to know about all kinds of good youth group games, that's where you go. The Australians have it down. They're kind of leading the way. Anyways, this is how you play Bible Smugglers. First, you need a decent-sized property for this game. I just played it in a big field. It was decent-sized, I suppose. Before you start the game, you explain to the youth how Christians risk their lives every day smuggling Bibles into communist countries.
Plus the troops,
Yeah. Which is, this was published in 2012, and it was strange. It's a strange sentence then, a strange sentence now. All youth must have a price... I'm sorry. There's a typo. Yeah, there's a typo in this. All youth must have a piece of wool tied around their wrist. This is their, quote, Bible. I don't know. We played with actual Bibles, so I don't know what that's about. But okay. Whatever. A leader leads the youth down to the further... This is full of typos. It's so hard to read. A leader leads the youth down to the furthest point of the property from the building. When they hear a whistle or a car horn, they must make their way from one end of the property back to the building. Meanwhile, the leaders are hiding around the property and are known as the, quote, communists, and have to catch the youth and take off their Bibles, parentheses, wool. This game must be played at night. Heaps of fun!
The materials needed are wool and then a whistle or car horn.
That's
I appreciate that a lot.
That's all you need.
The car horn is my favorite because it feels so extreme, but I like to imagine just one communist driving around in a car, like around the field of play, just honking.
In a tank. Literal tankies.
That's right.
It's very funny. It's a very funny concept, but I promise you guys this is real. This is a real thing that people have done in the world, and it's not something I've made up for this podcast. It's real. It's real and crazy.
There's a series of really good comments on this website. First of all, I love that there's a comment section on it. That's really great.
Yeah.
But the comments are wild because essentially it's a really weird argument that transpires about whether or not Christians actually have to oppose communists. And as a subspecies of that discourse, what other kinds of oppositional parties you could have and substitute instead of Christians and communists. Just a wild series of conversational comments here. One of my favorites is the youth will have no problem getting back to base because all the leaders will be too busy debating and arguing amongst themselves to notice. Nice. Gotcha, communists.
Communists, very good debaters, I've heard. I don't know. Is that like a dig at like bureaucracy or something, or like that? It's like like philosophy. I don't really even get the dig, but okay.
I don't know. Sandra D though, she's the one who said it, so take it up with her.
I will. I will be responding to this. You could also, Dean, if you wanted to, call it Romans versus Christians if you're afraid of offending someone. Triggered much?
I'm not.
There's a lot of good stuff here. Let me read this one real quick. This is great. This is like the sort of like voice of sanity here. This game is very offensive and almost racist. Christians need to learn and keep their noses out of other people's beliefs. Has Iraq and the Cold War taught us nothing? Come on, people. It's from George.
Nice.
But
good one, George.
I think that is good, George. However, Faith comments back on George and says, pretty sure communism isn't a race. Just saying.
That's all. My favorite comment, though, on this entire thread is from Heather. She says, I played this at my camp after my 5th grade year, only it was Romans and Christians. If you got caught by a Roman, you had to either deny your faith or be taken to jail, where the counselors were putting on basically an apologetics boot camp, yelling at the kids about how God didn't exist, and it was our job to try and convince them that he did. I absolutely love this game. It was one of the things I remember from camp, and it was so intense, but it was great. My first time LARPing.
It is actually really interesting to say this is LARPing, but not wrong, actually.
No, it's true. Not wrong at all. So, I guess that's a thing you could do. You could conversely, I guess, be smuggling manifestos into your evangelical church if you want to have a really nice twist on this game, and we'll take it from there, I guess.
And the Christians would send you to jail for sure. No problem.
Yeah, they sure would. You're never getting that wool back.
You're never getting that wool. Okay, so play Bible Smugglers on your own time, for sure. Play it with youth group, whatever. Or maybe don't and pretend it didn't happen because it's actually really embarrassing and really weird. But I think it is kind of indicative of the ways that a lot of sort of Western Christians think about Christianity in the DPRK, that like Christians there are, either non-existent or completely underground or always persecuted by the government or something like that. But in Dae Young Ryu's article, what we get is kind of a different sort of narrative, a counter narrative, if you will, that sheds some different types of light on this whole situation. So the way we've constructed this episode is kind of like a timeline that follows Ryu's article that I think pulls out the really important things about the DPRK and Christianity that maybe we didn't cover in the last episode. So I think the most important thing and the most interesting thing and kind of like the hinge which this entire article swings on is that Kim Il-sung, the guy who ends up being, the leader of the DPRK for the longest period of time, has a surprisingly Christian background.
Yeah, both of his parents were Christians, his mom and dad. His dad was a Christian nationalist, and his mom I think she was like a deacon or something in the Presbyterian church. In any case, she was pretty into it. The Ryu notes that in his autobiography, Kim plays down their like actual faithfulness, I guess. So he says that neither of them really took their belief in God seriously. And he says that, like, his mom, she would go to church, and when he asked her why, she said just kind of to get a break, more or less. Like, it wasn't really about participating in the life of Christianity as much as it was just about getting a break and having a place to relax or chill out. And Ryu disputes that. He disputes Kim's telling of it with some evidence that suggests that probably his parents were normal Christians who did believe in God. But nevertheless, it's kind of meaningful that Kim both admits that his parents are Christians and also plays down their Christianity. That very reflection, I think, is a good example of like the ambiguity that Christianity plays in the history of the DPRK. So kind of an interesting way to start things off, just to recognize that Kim owns his parents as Christians, like he fesses up to that or whatever, but not without kind of strategically or politically trying to downplay how authentically they held their faith.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first of all, if Kim Il-sung's parents did just go to church to kind of get away for a minute, like, I get it. Drop the kids off at the nursery and just, like, hang out for a bit is a very good strategy. Wouldn't shame anyone for doing that. But Ryu does note that, exactly like what you said, Dean, that maybe there's something else going on here by discounting his parents' faith. Ryu says, Kim's denial of his parents' Christian faith was a carefully constructed political statement. The fact that his parents were Christians, if publicly announced, could have created complex political ramifications for Kim as the supreme leader. And, like, I kind of get it. It might be a bad look.
It might be a bad look, and it also might give some wrong impressions or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's fair. It's probably also worth pointing out here, too, that Ryu's article is pretty... how would you put it? It's like it's an affirming take on the DPRK, but not completely uncritical. So like the critical moments that shine through are actually really helpful because you can kind of trust Ryu to be giving you a story that isn't, completely overladen with anti-communism. So points like that I think are really useful in an article like this.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think that like it's worth pointing out, that this is definitely a critical take, but also like a charitable critical take. Like, I don't know, I think that like counter narrative might be the best way to put it, in the sense that like, I don't know, you've heard all these really bad stories, but here's like one that you haven't heard. So
right,
I don't know, history is confusing.
Yeah, it is. Well, let's kind of follow Kim's life a little bit and see how that intertwines with the DPRK. So in the late 1920s, Kim Il-sung's dad died of frostbite, like in an untimely way. And he ended up meeting a Methodist pastor named Sun Jung-do. I guess it's probably also a good time to say like apologies for our very bad Midwestern pronunciations of Korean names. That's on us. But anyway, Sun Jung-do became a father figure to Kim. So it's a really important pastor in his life. And he was so important that Kim apparently taught Sunday school at his church. And then a few years later, Sun sent Kim some supplies when Kim was a prisoner for student agitation. So they had like a really close relationship, and it comes through in his autobiography and later in life. But Sun Jung-do kind of becomes a really like famous example of how nationalist Christians in particular were remembered for not only aiding Kim Il-sung as obviously a very important person in the DPRK, but also aiding the efforts of Korean people to get out from under the thumb of Japanese and eventually American imperialism.
Yeah, I don't have anything important to add to that whole thing you just said, except how absolutely buck wild would it be if your Sunday school teacher was Kim Il-sung?
Who touched that? No, just the supreme leader.
So jumping ahead a little bit from Kim Il-sung's father's death and this whole this Methodist pastor that's like really showing up here. Later in 1945, after the Japanese occupation was lifted, Soviet forces helped Kim Il-sung and the communists seize the North Korean government. A bunch of Christians defected south for a few reasons. Many of them were definitely sort of part of the bourgeoisie. They were landowners. And Dae Young Ryu, Kim Il-sung's uncle, and also a Presbyterian pastor, noted that this was because Christians were wealthier in Korea. Ryu says that many Christians were dissatisfied with land reform. Gang held that those Christian landlords who had fled to South Korea and were spreading rumors of, quote, religious persecution there were actually worried about their lands rather than their faith. There's also this part where I think it's where Dae Young Ryu says that like Christians are just like more reactionary than other people, which is
right.
Pretty funny. So there are some other figures too that kind of pop up. One that was particularly interesting to Dean and I, we don't really know much about her, but I want to find out everything now. A woman named An Sin-ho, sister of An Chang-ho, which is I guess another person that is significant to Kim Il-sung's life, but we literally know nothing about other than they show up in this article. They were both Christians who carried the Bible day and night, and Kim Il-sung remembered them pretty fondly and spoke about them in his memoirs. Nonetheless, even though they were Christians, at Kim's request, An Sin-ho worked for him as the vice chairperson of the Korean Democratic Women's Coalition that was formed in November 1945. Kim Il-sung praised the fact that An Sin-ho enthusiastically participated in socialist nation building and kept her Communist Party membership card between the leaves of the Bible she always carried. Now, that's a nice story.
It is a good one. It's really wholesome.
Real wholesome place to put your DSA card. Nah, JK.
The old church ladies bringing their Bibles and their Communist Party cards. That's the future I want to live in.
Yeah, no kidding. So I think what we can take away from these like few stories is just that like from an early age, Kim Il-sung was surrounded by people who professed a real type of authentic faith, even if he didn't always want to admit that was the case. So Christians were a big part of his early life, and you have to reason that those good experiences early on probably had a lasting effect, and that's exactly what Ryu wants to argue that we'll talk about a little bit later at the end of the podcast.
And I think it's pretty amazing, actually, to keep that in mind, that it had a lasting effect, because Christians were not exactly all enthusiastic, as you were just saying, Matt, quoting Dae Young Ryu, that a lot of Christians left because they were more concerned about their land than their faith, for example. And that's really important to kind of keep in mind because the kinds of reforms that happened in the DPRK were extremely rapid, like amazingly quick. And the fact that Christians reacted also like really intensely in a kind of anti-communist way is not surprising when you take the perspective that like a lot of them would have had more to lose rather than more to gain, for example.
Yeah.
So for example, like in March 1946, the DPRK carried out this land reform. So they confiscated all this land and then just like freely redistributed it. But the crazy part of it is that it took them only a month to do this because it was so widely popular among peasants in Korea. Like they had no problem convincing the majority of the country that that's what they ought to do.
Yeah, Ryu goes on to say that like this is such a popular thing because most of the farmers in rural North Korea, they were like tenant farmers and were renting out land from somebody else. So most of those people had probably had like, started to leave the country as they saw the winds a changing. But the tenant farmers were obviously very, very into this.
Right. Yeah, and Ryu also mentions that a lot of pastors at that time, too, were preaching the kind of gospel that you might expect to hear in the West, that if you're a good Christian, you work really hard and you get what you deserve, right? So for them to give this stuff up was kind of like giving up a part of the weird sort of capitalist faith that they had been inculcated in. So to go south, because the country was divided in half after the defeat of Japan, to go south and sort of into the open arms of like American capitalists and missionaries who were telling them that same narrative was more appealing to them than staying, trying to work it out.
Yeah, man. Ideology is a hell of a drug. So after the land reforms happened in 1946, later that year, the Provisional People's Congress, which is sort of like the revolutionary government before it's actually articulated as a country, starts sort of like broadcasting a platform to the people of the DPRK that not only was socialist, but affirmed the rights of speech, press, assembly, and religion. It's in there in 1946. So again, that's not a codified constitution because that doesn't happen until 1948. But in 46, they are at least making some promises about things that will become really relevant in 1 second.
Though that same year, they ended up holding elections because, as you just said, this wasn't a real government quite yet, right? It's a nascent government. So in October 1946, they have these elections, and Christians end up becoming kind of a significant part of that, but not for the reasons that you might hope. The Presbyterian umbrella organization that was in a certain region of the DPRK announced that Christians couldn't participate in elections that were going to be held on Sunday. And it was a pretext for them to resist participating in the government at all, but they used the religious day, Sunday, to oppose that. And also some of the elections were going to be held in churches as like voting spaces, which they were not into. And Kim Il-sung was very pissed about that. So here's something that Ryu says. The association's decision, Kim argued, was, quote, made by the anti-national traitors in league with the American imperialists to shatter the democratic election in the North by misusing the Christian doctrine. End quote. Contending that the Bible said that religious individuals could do good works on the Sabbath and even elected church officers on the Sabbath, Kim asked the pastors why Christians could not participate in the election of the People's Congress, which was indeed a good work for the fatherland and the people. Pretty amazing throwing down of some good Sunday school teacher Bible knowledge there.
Yeah, for sure. That's a Sunday school lesson I would like. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like on the one hand, you get kind of like Anabaptist vibe from this. Like, no, we're not going to participate in the state at all. But it's actually just got real sort of like reactionary overtones that we should pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, Presbyterians are not known for being anti-statist. So.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's because of the state specifically, and sort of anti-communist tendencies that they are not going to just do this.
Right. So that gives you kind of maybe a little bit of a look at how Christians are appearing on like both sides of the revolutionary situation. So on the one hand, you have, Kim Il-sung's uncle, like Dae Young Ryu, who ends up establishing a whole organization for Korean Christians who support the government. Lots of Christians join it. It's a big deal. And at the same time, there are all kinds of other Christians who are like actively trying to sabotage or subvert the efforts of the revolutionary movement to slowly coalesce. So it's like the class struggle is appearing right through the church.
Yeah, exactly. It's good to note that I mean, like, at least in the rhetoric in the West, like Christianity becomes such a divisive type of like word to use with regards to communist countries, and especially the DPRK, where it's like, they're persecuting Christians or whatever, and like they are persecuting people, but they are not. It's not because they're Christians. It's because of different reasons, because they have ties to like foreign countries and imperialism and stuff. This whole thing with the elections is just so interesting because it's just like the most Christian thing in the world, actually. Just to say, like, no, we're not going to do it. And there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, it's true. And to base that in a completely ridiculous appeal to Christian principles. I mean, Kim Il-sung is like totally right to say that it's a misuse of Christian doctrine for the sake of imperialism.
Like, remember in the Bible when this exact thing happens where someone's like, Jesus, can you do things on the Sabbath? And he's like, I guess so.
And to consider actually voting as like a good work is a pretty creative and cool interpretation, right? That like just like pulling an ox out of a ditch or whatever, having your say in the people's government is a good thing that you can do.
Yeah, exactly. So there you go.
All right, so this all happens before the DPRK gets established officially with the Constitution and everything. But tell me a little bit, Matt, what happens in 1948 as they're trying to like codify some of these tendencies.
Yeah, so some things change in interesting ways. Right, so this 1946. They're voting. They're sort of trying to establish a government, write a constitution, and so on. So the DPRK like actually becomes a country in 1948. That's when they sort of like have a constitution to kind of show people. Ryu says this about 1948. Its constitution did not guarantee full religious freedom, but rather allowed for the, quote, freedom of faith, unquote. Religious people could practice their religion by building religious facilities and performing religious ceremonies. All North Korean constitutions thereafter did not have within them any provision for the freedom of religion, because religion per se was something ultimately to be eradicated as part of the socialist revolution. Okay, so there's a pretty big turn in rhetoric in the ways that religion is being talked about by sort of the official government sources, whereas the Provisional People's Congress said that they were for the freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion. In 1948, when it actually gets laid out in the Constitution, it's not for the freedom of religion, but the freedom of faith. And that is an interesting difference. I don't really know exactly what to say about what that difference is. Whenever I read it, I keep getting the feeling that in the DPRK you can be spiritual but not religious or something. But at the same time, right. I don't know. The freedom of faith at least means that you can build buildings and perform religious ceremonies. So I don't know exactly how it's different than like the freedom of religion, but there must be something kind of else going on there that we can draw out that's different. What do you think, Dean?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think, too, a little bit about what it might mean to, for example, okay, say you're a Catholic and you live in the DPRK and you have the freedom of faith. Well, presumably, like, you can go to Mass and the priest could, like, whatever, do the whole thing, and you could go home and, like, live in a society that isn't trying to, like, obliterate you in a number of ways. And at that point, it's kind of like, well, what is there really left to say about what it would mean to lead a religious life? It's not like you can't read religious texts. It's not like you can't meditate on them or hang out with other Christians or anything like that. Ryu goes on to say you can't like proselytize or like leave Bibles around or something. You can't pass out tracts and stuff. But like that doesn't really sound so bad to me. However, Ryu does go on to say that it became like an open question of how much liberty Christians really had to feel free to be themselves. And Kim Il-sung himself, reflecting on it, says that like he sometimes wonders if maybe they had been a little too heavy-handed, and he thinks that some communists had certainly alienated Christians at that point in time, which he calls them false communists, actually, which is pretty wild.
Yeah, the feeling I get after reading, more of the article, that the freedom of faith versus freedom of religion means that, like, the freedom of faith means that religion is, like, mutable, whereas, like, you can have faith in whatever you want, but, like, your religious, like, organization is mutable by the state. They can make decisions to limit that freedom if it became relevant.
Right.
And as we see, and what's going to happen next, it becomes relevant.
Yeah, so the country becomes a constitutionally based country in 1948, but only 2 years later, that's when the Korean War officially starts. And this is, like you were just saying, when Christianity really becomes a thing that needs to be thought about really carefully. Here's something that Ryu writes, kind of reflecting on the damage that happens during the Korean War. And this has, like, special relevance for Christianity, as Ryu will go on to say. So he writes, one U.S. Air Force general commented, we burned down every town in North Korea. The relentless and indiscriminate American bombing hardly left a worthy target standing and produced a virtual Holocaust. Thus, there was really no place for Christians to assemble for services because the U.S. bombers had destroyed all the religious facilities. Many Christians reportedly perished in churches because they sought shelter there, believing that Americans would never bomb churches. In the end, the North Korean people regarded Christianity as only the religion of America, their archenemy, and thus Christians had to hide their religious identity. So this is obviously a pretty significant turning point in the relationship between Christianity and the DPRK generally. And though, I mean, some of us who are Christians might want to imagine, an alternative where, like, Christians in the DPRK could really make it clear that they weren't about that or whatever. And a lot of Christians there did do exactly that. It's also pretty understandable why they would start being suspicious of the religion of people who are literally, like, trying to leave no brick on top of another brick in their country.
Yeah, exactly. This bothers me so much in, like, a real existential kind of way. Evangelical Christianity, especially in the U.S., has games like Bible Smugglers. Well, we just think about how horrible it is that, like, Christians might be persecuted in the DPRK, but at the same time, like, none of those evangelical Christians are also, like, upset about the entire country being, like, burnt down and entire churches being bombed. Right? There's, like, no criticism of like the very regime that did that. And even, like, what's crazier is that, like, I mean, it's not the case that probably every United States soldier who was in the Korean War was a Christian, but I'm sure a lot of them actually were, and they still destroyed every church in the country. So it's not like, I mean, looking at the Korean War and sort of like the massive devastation, it is hard to say that Christianity made a difference for the soldiers of the United States.
Right. At least not a positive one that you would want in your country.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I guess all of the sort of, like, hand-wringing about persecution in that country of Christians, just it feels so hollow to me because, like, you're missing the bigger picture.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, situations like this always remind me too of, like, the situation in China. It's kind of a similar thing. Like, there were tons of Christians in China who really happily supported the communist revolution there. And the state in China even went as far as to, like, officially sanction a Protestant and then later a Catholic expression that they were like, yeah, you could totally be Christians here as long as you're not going to, like, ruin the revolution. And like, they went out of their way to do that. But nevertheless, like, Western Christians didn't really understand that and, like, basically tried to, like, agitate with Christianity against, Chinese communism. And the same kind of thing in Korea. Like, there's all kinds of American influence and missions influencers that are trying to get into Korea via Christianity. And, like, it makes complete and total sense that faced with that kind of problem, like, you might take a more disciplinary stance.
Yeah, it's so weird. I mean, we haven't done an episode on, like, the Three Self movement or something in China.
Right.
But what is always really surprising to me about those types of things, like, the state-sanctioned church in China is, that Christians in the United States view them as, like, somehow, like, co-opted by the state. But like if you read their theological statements, they're like really conservative. Like
Right.
way more conservative than like I think most churches in the United States, or at least I don't know, most mainline Protestant churches probably. So it's just weird. Like what I don't know it unless it's like thinly ideologically veiled sort of like we don't like you because of your different economy and different social system. I don't really understand like what the difference is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, but that's it, right? Like, it's a total double standard. And it's also, like, most Christians in the West, I think, can't wrap their mind around the idea that Christians would actively want to build a communist society, would want to be part of that process. So it has to feel like them getting co-opted. Whereas, like, anti-imperialist Christians, you know, they, like, can't imagine being a Christian and, like, actively trying to, like, campaign for, like, a U.S. president or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just a matter of kind of seeing where Christianity is actually covering up a deeper class commitment or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Dang. Makes me so annoyed.
All right, so the Korean War like totally devastates the DPRK. Like we were just saying, there's nothing left, and so they have to rebuild, and they do that through all kinds of really big socialist projects. And throughout that, Kim Il-sung in the very beginning is constantly trying to invite Christians and other people into that process. He says it's important to invite what he calls people who have a past. So that might be landlords or capitalists, but also like maybe Christians. But nevertheless, what he's trying to say is like Korea needs to rebuild and everyone needs to be brought into the ability to make a contribution. So that's kind of like immediately post-war Kim Il-sung trying to put the country back together. But later on, in the late 50s, religion starts to disappear pretty dramatically after like 1958 in Kim Il-sung's published speeches. So Ryu says this: before that time, Kim Il-sung always put religious people on his list of various elements found in the North Korean population and mentioned them specifically whenever he addressed to all the people of the country, whenever he like made an address. This change has made some observers speculate that religion disappeared from North Korea after the 50s. However, Kim Il-sung repeatedly said in October 1958, after the cooperation system was completed, that should anyone want to proceed with us, we will not make an issue of their past, even if they used to be capitalist landlords or pastors. So that people of the past rhetoric comes back later on, and Ryu says, even though Kim apparently feels that he doesn't need to mention it quite as often or something like that, this is evidence that there still are people who used to be pastors. There still are people who are Christians who are hanging out, and he doesn't want to like push them off in the late 50s anyway.
There's even one point in the article where Ryu says something like that Kim Il-sung was like inclusive, and I feel like that might be a little bit of an overstatement. But still, I kind of get I get the meaning, at least, that like there's no person sort of too far gone to participate in the rebuilding of DPRK.
I mean, it's a real Christian idea, actually,
yeah,
right?
It
in
is.
a certain way that, yeah, like nobody is so far gone they couldn't sort of be forgiven and reconciled to their community or something.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, fast forwarding again another few years. That was in 1958, but in 1967, there was like a kind of like small cultural revolution within the DPRK that happened largely because of the Sino-Soviet split. So Ryu says this: thus, Kim had to ride out this difficult situation. His solution was pronounced and appeared in a statement in May of 1967. Kim ostensibly took a middle ground between the views of Khrushchev and Mao, but in reality he sided with Mao and chose to carry out an ideological policy that became a, quote, small-scale cultural revolution of China. Just as in China, the North Korean Cultural Revolution began to absolutize Kim Il-sung's authority in terms of the proper interpretation of ideology, and thus it strengthened the cult of personality surrounding Kim. Okay, so from this, we can see, like, in 1958, Kim Il-sung's trying to, like, pull Christians in and still make them come apart, being exclusive, maybe. Whereas later in the 60s, the position becomes a bit more ambiguous. Kim Il-sung said that educators should target religions in the classroom, but also good Christians were still like okay to have house churches and their own spaces of worship. Like they weren't like outlawed or anything, but there was like a more antagonistic relationship that maybe played up tensions a bit more. However, I guess kind of like muddying the waters a little bit more, or like adding to the ambiguity of the whole situation. In 1968, the North Korean government reportedly allowed older and cooperative Christians like An Sin-ho, the church lady who had her Communist Party card in her Bible, to hold worship services and officially recognized about 200 places of house services. A close examination of propaganda works of that time also reveals that the target of these attacks was not religious faith per se. So there's a more ambiguous sort of stance on religion, where it's not like good, it's kind of antagonistic. At the same time, house churches are okay. It seems like what Ryu wants to kind of push as the counter narrative, though, is that Christians are fine, but Christians who sort of like import imperialism through their faith are not fine. That's the sort of moral of the story, I think, that we start getting in the later 60s.
Right, and the identification of Christianity with American imperialism is still super strong at that point in time, and only like gaining speed even, which I think is pretty important. So like if you're an old church lady who wants to hang out with other Christians in your house church, and you like served like an official government post, like you're fine, do whatever you want, that's okay. But they, like I said earlier, like Kim probably didn't want Christianity to spread in North Korea for a lot of good reasons. And so they started a kind of cultural project of trying to whittle down Christianity and American imperialism as attractive options for people living in Korea. There's an example that Ryu gives of a film that was made where there's like a Korean pastor who ends up becoming friends with an American missionary, and then it turns out that the American missionary is a spy, and they feel like totally betrayed. And the idea is that, I mean, the American missionary is totally the villain, but the Korean pastor, it's not really his faith that ever becomes something that you that's presented as a thing that you wouldn't want or something. It just is the case that like this is a situation that happened, and the moral you're supposed to take away is that like American missionaries are bad, not so much that like Christians in Korea are bad or something like that. So that's a kind of like subtle, somewhat anti-Christian, but not completely and totally anti-Christian propaganda that Ryu notes is coming out at this time, like in the late 60s.
Yeah, that's good. It just adds to sort of the complexity of the situation. I mean, I guess what's always so striking to me in these situations are the ways that American imperialism are so wrapped up in so many expressions of Christianity. Like, how could you really be like a Christian missionary and go to a different country and not sort of also spread a political ideology just like latently? So I don't know.
Right.
That there's like a certain level of paranoia to it, but at the same time, like that paranoia doesn't seem altogether unwarranted.
Right. And another thing too that is part of this is that Ryu points out that throughout different parts of the DPRK's history, I mean, Kim Il-sung is still hoping for a unified Korea, and eventually, as he starts opening himself up to other parts of the West, he's also anticipating that this means people in North Korea are going to be encountering Christianity again, but it will be explicitly packaged in imperialist language. Mm-hmm. And he's like not wrong about that.
Yeah.
So these are basically supposed to be measures that should prepare the populace for like seeing imperialism when it's imperialism, when it comes in the guise of Christianity or something. And like that's not a bad idea. Like that's not bad propaganda at all. Teaching people to recognize when Christianity is like actually secretly a vehicle for capitalism is like very good and important. I mean, obviously there's like a lot of collateral damage probably that comes along with that, like ideological damage. But nevertheless, like the effort is understandable, I think.
Yeah, and especially when like the country that literally destroyed your entire country has games like smuggling Bibles. Hard not to see how this adds up. Well,
right.
Riffing off that exact like tension and that sort of point of concern, in December 1972, the DPRK passed a new constitution titled the Socialist Constitution. Great name. That's what I would have called that too.
Not beating around the bush.
No. Let me just take it one step back too. The Socialist Constitution is the name of the Constitution that they kind of like the new one. But in in past decades, like in 1958 or something like that, Kim Il-sung even just like goes as far to announce to say that like, yeah, we did socialism. Like, it's done here.
Yeah.
We figured it out. And it's a big claim, big if true, but there you go. They claim it. Okay, anyways, so in 1972, they passed a new constitution titled the Socialist Constitution. It is particularly important for Christians in the DPRK and those relationships. Ryu says this: "It was particularly noticeable that the new constitution added the freedom of anti-religious propaganda clause to the provision of religion." So that is significant because up until this point, there was not it wasn't guaranteed that there'd be a freedom of anti-religious propaganda, which is a pretty big part of other communist revolutions around the world. It was definitely a big part of the Soviet Revolution in the Soviet Union to have anti-religious propaganda. That was like a big deal. But it wasn't even like something that you could officially do until 1972 in the DPRK. So that is something that I think is significant. But again, I think it has a lot to do with that possibility of reunification or opening up to the West, in the sense that like if they are going to start having more people from the West kind of in their country and more Christians for sure, then because of that, then it's important that they have sort of like this way to counteract religious propaganda. So it's not like the idea behind anti-religious propaganda isn't entirely just because they're like wanting to persecute Christians in their own country. It's probably, also because of that, but it's because it's like a counteractive measure against the possible opening up of the DPRK.
Yeah, and I mean, it's pretty amazing to point out that in the first constitution, whatever limits religious people did indeed have, they still had a constitutional right to have freedom of faith. And there was not an analogous constitutional right to attack people's faith, which is pretty interesting. I mean, you'd have to just study this a lot closer, I think, which would be very hard to do for a lot of reasons. But even comparing something like religious freedom, for example, in the United States and DPRK would be interesting, right? Like, it's really hard to be an atheist in the United States, and historically has been extremely difficult to find some kind of constitutional protection for if you wanted to spread anti-religious propaganda. I mean, you would struggle to do that. So as late as 1972 in the DPRK is a pretty crazy turning point and pretty crazy testament to at least recognizing that like the openness to religion within a communist framework in the earlier instantiations of DPRK's constitution is like very unique in the world stage.
Yeah, I think so too. It complicates the narrative, that's for sure.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the 80s. So that constitution happens in 72. But where you might think that would kind of open the floodgates to like a ton of anti-Christian rhetoric, there actually are also some really interesting experiments that are explicitly opening up to Christianity in the next decades. So in the 80s, a thing called Juche ideology starts to develop in a really interesting direction with respect to Christianity. So Juche is a thing that has been around in Korea since before the revolution even, and it slowly kind of becomes a more and more nation-defining set of like tenets and theories as time goes on, and there's like a lot to be said about what that is and what it isn't. A lot of things I'm not really qualified to say. But the salient point is that Juche theory is like a huge deal. It sets the tone for the DPRK. And there is a Juche Ideology Institute. And during the 1980s, there were some really interesting moments where Juche theorists were trying to make sense of Christianity. So Ryu points out this one guy, Park Seung-deok, who was a theorist at that institute, and he had a kind of critical line of Marxist-Leninist materialism on by appealing to different themes in Juche. So Ryu writes this: according to Park, Marxist-Leninism saw the nature of Christianity only as its illusory and mystical worldview. Juche ideology, however, found that the nature of Christianity was, quote, the view of life that showed the autonomous way of life to the people who opposed oppression and subjugation and desired freedom and equality, end quote. Thus, Juche ideology could have a productive dialogue with Christianity, quote, to seek common methods of life and struggle for human salvation and human liberation, end quote. I think that's really crazy. I mean, he's inviting a Juche Christian dialogue, if you will, where there's been plenty of Christian Marxist dialogue, for example. And he's even trying to suggest that maybe Juche has a certain advantage in that conversation because there are reasons that it can be a little more open to Christianity, because it doesn't rely on certain materialist assumptions that Marxism-Leninism has. And that's not the only example Ryu gives. He gives several other examples of some of these experiments happening. But I just pulled that out to say that, like, so now that the Constitution has a freedom of anti-religious propaganda, like, that's a thing for sure. But also, like, the very theorists of the ideology that, sets the tone of the entire country is actively trying to find points of contact with Christianity. So it's still, like, a very ambiguous situation.
Yeah, exactly. Then the next decade, a lot of the things that we're pulling out here, a lot of these themes are just kind of reaffirmed. So in 1992, the Constitution gets amended again, and basically, like, nothing really changes with regards to religious faith or the freedom to it. It basically just reaffirms the freedom of faith and that like religion still shouldn't be used to attract foreign power. So it's like nothing really changes from like the Constitution. Like the official sort of position doesn't really change. Freedom of faith is always sort of guaranteed in the Constitution of the DPRK, which is, I think, something worth saying. Even more monumental than that, in March of 1992, the Korean Christian Federation invites Billy Graham to come talk in the DPRK. So, like, he does. And he talks to Kim Il-sung there. And then that was on TV in the DPRK. So, like, I don't know what to make of that exactly. I don't even know what Billy Graham said. But, like, just like the narrative of constant persecution of Christians or something just doesn't quite add up with all of these things. With all these things happening.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting too, because, like, Franklin Graham has been to the DPRK,
right? And
that's the craziest thing I could ever imagine, because Franklin Graham, the only reason that I even know that he exists is because, like, every once in a while I mistakenly look at my Facebook and, like, people that I know from when I was, like, in a weird evangelical church for a while just share, like, really stupid things that he says, like hyper reactionary conspiracy theories. And, like, even Franklin Graham is like, I don't know, we should probably work things out with North Korea. So, like, I don't know, it's a completely wild situation, because inviting Billy Graham, or especially Franklin Graham, to come to your country is definitely inviting, like, Christo-fascism into your country. Like, it's inviting Christian imperialism into your country for sure.
Yeah.
But, like, they're doing it in, like, an interesting kind of controlled environment.
Yeah, exactly. If you're gonna invite Billy Graham into your country, you better have, like, an anti-religion sort of propaganda wing set up.
Yeah, exactly. So here's another item in 1992. So Ryu says something that we couldn't actually quite figure out exactly, but we'll mention it here anyway, and people who are smarter than us can maybe make sense of it. But he says that Juche is constitutionally distinguished from Marxism-Leninism. So, like, it's been an ideology that has set the pace of North Korea for a long time, but now it's like a constitutional thing that they're no longer Marxist-Leninists, they follow Juche ideology. Exactly what the ins and outs of that are not entirely clear. But here's just kind of an interesting thing that Ryu notes is something of a consequence of Juche ideology becoming more and more prevalent. And I'll read a quote that kind of doesn't seem like it has a lot to do with that at first, but it will by the very end. So Ryu writes, the person to whom Kim paid most attention to in his memoir was Sung Jung-do. That's the Methodist pastor that we mentioned earlier, who, like, sent him stuff in prison and was kind of a father figure to him. Kim devoted an entire chapter of his memoir to Sun. Kim's memoir, just as his other published writings, became required reading for the people of North Korea. A high official informed South Korean Christians and scholars that, quote, everybody from elementary school students to adults knew of Sun Jung-do, end quote. Kim Il-sung's mention of his relationship with these individuals led to an official reappraisal of their religion. Beginning in the 1990s, dictionaries and lexicons began to devise their descriptions of religion-related entries, and their explanations became as neutral and objective as those found in any Western reference book. For instance, the Dictionary of Modern Korean in 1981 defined Christianity as a religion that, quote, preaches the people to obey the ruling class, end quote. In comparison, the new Grand Dictionary of Korean, this is in 1992 when all these changes are going on, explained that the key idea of Christianity was equality and compassion. So, I mean, it just gives you kind of an idea, too, about how, like, the state's view of Christianity is changing and evolving, going from, like, having a Presbyterian pastor as the vice president to having a small cultural revolution that antagonizes certain Christian expressions to eventually changing the very dictionary definitions of Christianity.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot from one end to the other. But still, I mean, you have to think about how Kim Il-sung's early life definitely like set the pace for a lot of those changes and a lot of those like sort of positions.
For sure.
It makes the DPRK just vastly different than other socialist countries with regards to religion. So pretty interesting. Following all these changes in 1992, Kim Il-sung died in 1994 and was succeeded by his son, Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il didn't really make very many changes with regards to Kim Il-sung's stances on religion, or at least that's the way that Ryu reports it. So if he did, it's not in this essay. And then after Kim Jong-il died, Kim Jong-un took power and hasn't made really any changes either. So there you go. Kim Il-sung has had a sort of lasting effect with regards to the way that the DPRK has sort of interpreted, made space, included and excluded, and then included again Christians.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, Ryu notes that Kim Il-sung has become, a pretty massive authoritative figure within the DPRK, like hugely massive. In a real kind of sense, the fact that Kim Il-sung did say so many positive things about Christianity and, memorialized some Christians in his memoir, means that, like, that's just a part of the DPRK's history, like, non-negotiably, and will continue to be for the foreseeable future. It would be very, very hard to probably dislodge Kim Il-sung's authoritative presence there. I mean, like, they changed the name of Juche ideology at one point to Kim Il-sungism, so, it's something that's not gonna just, like, fade away.
Yeah, exactly. It makes me kind of think, like, okay, there's, like, a weird alternative future that could have been possible here. Like, like, in like, the 60s and 70s, and, I mean, I guess even into the 80s, there was all of this, like, Marxist Christian dialogue with regards to, like, Central America, and like we read Fray Beto's stuff about Fidel Castro, that kind of stuff. Like there's all of that going on, but it just like makes you think like what if Christians weren't so awful to begin with? Like I know that's oversimplifying it for sure, right? Like there's definitely problems kind of all around, but like just like what if Christians weren't imperialists? Like what would that future be like?
Yeah.
I imagine like it would just mean that like more Christians would just be kind of down with the revolution and kind of like adjust to that society, because it's not all that incompatible, especially
right.
Like if you're not showing up for the country that's trying to like bomb you. So I don't know, it's just such a weird thing that like if Christians just like didn't take this like necessarily adversarial sort of stance, that history the history of like the persecution of Christians would be way different.
Totally. Yeah, and like I don't want to give the impression that we think Kim Il-sung is like some hero of Christianity or like some proponent of like Christianity in a communist context. Like he wasn't. If he had it his way, like nobody would be a Christian. And he like wanted people to discover that voluntarily on their own by virtue of participating in a social society for the most part. So, like, it's not to say that he's a, defender of, like, religious freedom at every turn or anything. But I think that, like, the story of the DPRK helps to dramatize that imperialism and anti-imperialism cuts right through Christianity as a community. I mean, it's what drives me crazy about so many groups that talk about, like, do you know how many Christians are in prison in the DPRK? And it's like, well, first of all, no, and neither do you. Like, nobody knows that. But secondly, like, do you know how many Christians are in prison in the United States?
Right.
And, like, framing the question that way just sounds stupid, right? Because, like, that's not how you would ever put it. Like, there are people in prison in the United States, and, like, I mean, we think prisons are bad, but, like, they're not in prison because they're Christians. And like the DPRK seems to be like kind of the same deal. I mean, presumably like you could be imprisoned for like doing a certain kind of Christian thing or like living out a certain life that you think is Christian or whatever. But that's not like completely unreasonable. I mean, if you're a Christian in the United States and you say, I don't know, belonged to like the Black Panther Party, then maybe you would also go to prison for like being a Christian in a real sense, right?
Or like if you're a Christian in the United States and then you like, I don't know, like snuck into a draft office and like burned a bunch of draft cards or something, or like poured blood on a nuclear weapon, like you might also go to jail for being a Christian. But it's like drastically different in the DPRK because like in those senses you're not doing something that's actually good. You're just like trying to be like an imperialist.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's all I'm trying to say really is like, Christianity just functions as this thing where other Christians can kind of say, oh, like think of the Christians. It's like, think of the children. They're these like purely innocent creatures or whatever. But like, you just have to like think a little bit harder, I think, about it. And, turn that question back on yourself too. Like how absurd would it be to say like, people are just in prison, like all these Christians are in prison in the US or something.
Yeah. Again, like think of the Christians, but think of them when like they were in churches and like we were bombing them.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, we're kind of getting to the end here. We're already past the end, actually. Maybe we can round out with a couple of conclusions. I don't know, Matt, what are you going to take away from this article?
I think what I can take away from this article is that the DPRK is usually looked at as like, the weirdest place on earth. Dean, whenever we're together, we always joke about like those really weird Vice documentaries where it's just like, some guy who's like completely stoned out of his mind. He shows up in the DPRK. He's like, yo, I'm in the DPRK and this place is crazy and weird. But like, when you get into it, DPRK is, actually normal people who want to live their lives in a sort of a self-determined way. And they have to do that sort of in the shadow of, their entire country being destroyed by the United States, and also in the shadow of like ongoing imperialism. And when we start kind of looking at the way they act, like it can actually like makes a lot of sense if you think about the geopolitical dynamics of those situations, that like, they're not just persecuting Christians for like no reason or something.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think too, like trying to see, one thing that I'll pull away anyway is trying to see Kim Il-sung as one more communist who's trying to think creatively about how to engage Christians and other faiths, but like sometimes making mistakes doing that, sometimes having some actually really interesting successes doing that. I mean, we didn't talk much about like the Korean Christian Federation, but that's like a huge deal. That's a thing that existed there. And I guess I'm just gonna like, put him in a category along with people like Fidel Castro and others of like people who I want to continue to think with about like how to kind of integrate these worlds and like build some connective bridges and tissues. And hopefully, who knows, the Pope will be in the DPRK and there'll be more to be said about that.
That's all you can hope for. Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what you heard on this episode, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/themagnificast. You can also follow us on Twitter @themagnificast. We have a Facebook page for sure that we never update. And we also have a Facebook group that we participate in all the time called the Magnificast Basement. So get in on that good group. It's also private, so you can post all the things you want and no one from your family will ever read them. They're just between you, the group, and Jesus.
Unless your family's cool and they're also part of the group.
Oh man, now that's something. That would be a weird thing. I never thought about people who listen to this and also their parents that could listen to this. That would be just too much for me. Anyways.
Just wait. One day, there's going to be several generations. There's
Oh.
going to be a generational photo of people listening to our podcast.
Oh boy. That makes me anxious. Special thanks to Amari Armstrong for the intro music, and it's extremely special thanks to the Illogical Spoon for their outro music. We never asked them if we could use it, we just did, and they think it's okay, I guess. Cool, so catch you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.